Welcome back to Nature Documentary for Sleep. If you want, leave a comment on where you're listening from. And consider liking and subscribing. Tonight, you're in Yosemite Valley, and you're here to catch the real culprit. It's before dawn on the valley floor, pine-sweet air in your lungs, granite walls still in silhouette. At first, you assume this is just a river canyon with good lighting and a famous name. Then you notice the problem. The walls are too sheer, the floor is too wide, and the curves are too smooth. You follow the Merced River upstream, and it feels almost polite for a place this oversized. So, you start reading the rock the way you read a map. Polished slabs under your boots, faint scratches, and boulders that don't belong. If water didn't have the force to carve a trough like this, what did basal sliding and plucking do differently when the ice got thick enough? You crouch down and run your glove over the granite, and it feels oddly slick for bare stone. Not wet slick, not moss slick, but buffed, like the earth got bored and decided to sand its own teeth. A river can polish, sure, but it usually leaves a mess behind. Gravel bars, sharp edges, the kind of chaos you expect from moving water. Here, the bedrock looks like it was cleaned, flattened, and reprimanded. Then your headlamp catches the faintest lines, straight and stubborn, scratched into the rock. They do not curve like water. They march in one direction like a dragged nail across a table. You follow them, and the direction points right up the valley, as if something heavy once had a commute. The escalation is simple and uncomfortable. If these are glacial striations, then the valley floor was once under ice thick enough to press stone into submission, which means you are not standing in a peaceful valley. You are standing in the footprint of a moving weight. You take a few slow steps toward the river, and you listen. The Merced is there, whispering and rearranging pebbles, doing its small work. But beside it, you notice boulders perched in places that make no sense. A block of pale rock sits on darker granite like misplaced furniture in an empty room. It is not from this spot. It is a stranger, delivered here and abandoned. You touch it and feel the grain, different minerals, a different story. The river did not carry this, not with this mass, not without leaving a train of destruction. So you make your first real decision. You stop following the water and you start following the evidence. You angle away from the channel and toward a broad slab rising out of the meadow. The air is colder there, trapped against stone that never quite warms at night. Your boots scuff over sand that looks too fine, almost like flour. It puffs softly, and in the beam of your light, it hangs in the air longer than it should. That is rock flour, granite ground down until it is practically a powder. It is what happens when ice drags rock across rock for centuries, patient and merciless. You stand up and you look at the walls again. They are still silhouettes, but even in the dark you can read their geometry. The cliffs rise too cleanly, too straight, like the valley was widened by a tool, not a river. Rivers cut a V, sharp and narrow, always trying to focus their energy into a single groove. This is a U, broad-shouldered, carved as if the land was scooped. And now that you have seen it, you cannot unsee it. You walk slow and careful, because smooth granite can be treacherous when it hides a thin film of frost. Each step becomes a quiet argument with gravity. The valley floor is flat enough to tempt you into believing it is stable, but your eyes keep drifting to the talus piles at the base of the cliffs. Those heaps of broken rock are not decorative. They are the valley reminding you that the walls are still shedding skin. A sharp crack echoes somewhere far up the dark face. It is small, probably just a stone snapping loose in the cold, but it lands with a faint clatter you feel in your ribs. Yosemite does not need to be dramatic to be dangerous. It just needs time. You keep moving upstream, using the river as a reference line. On your left, the meadow is a low, damp breadth of ground. On your right, the granite rises in long, rounded backs, domes that look smooth enough to slide off. You think of exfoliation, sheets of granite peeling away like layers of an onion. It sounds gentle, like self-care. It is actually pressure release, the rock cracking as the weight above it disappears. The valley was once buried under a thicker world, and the granite remembers the compression. Now it is relaxing, and it relaxes by breaking. You reach another polished stretch, and the scratches sharpen. They cut across the slab in parallel lines, some deep, some faint. You imagine the underside of a glacier, not clean white like postcards, but filthy and armed. A belly full of stones, sand, and broken blocks, all jammed into the ice like studs in a boot. Fossil sliding is the phrase, clinical and neat. In human terms, it is an ice sheet dragging its gravel-laced stomach over your house. Plucking is worse because it sounds like something you do with a guitar string. In reality, it is ice freezing into cracks, then ripping whole blocks free when it moves. It is dentistry, but for mountains. You stand still, and in the quiet, you feel the valley as a shaped space. You can almost sense the missing ice, the absence of weight. The air is too thin for that, you tell yourself, but your body is good at remembering pressure, even imagined pressure. The evidence keeps stacking, and the stakes get clearer. If you misread these clues, you do not just misunderstand Yosemite. You misunderstand what ice can do when it shows up uninvited. A glacier is not snow. It is snow that stopped leaving. It is winter refusing to move out. And once it settles in, it starts renovating. The sky lightens by degrees, and the valley edges sharpen from silhouette to detail. Pine needles glint with cold dew. The rock face across from you emerges, pale and immense, with long vertical seams, joints, cracks in the granite, lines of weakness that run like secret wiring through the cliff. They look like random fractures, but they are the valley's pre-written script. Ice did not carve wherever it wanted. It carved where the rock was already prepared to fail. You walk toward one of those seams, and you find a fresh scar. A patch of rock is lighter than everything around it, raw and new. Below it, shattered fragments lie in a fan. Rockfall is not an ancient problem here. It is a current event. And suddenly, the polished slabs under your feet feel less like a museum exhibit. They feel like a crime scene that never closed. You tilt your head up, and you can see the top of the wall now, just barely. The rim is far above, and the cliff between you and it looks like a single unbroken drop. You imagine what it would take to make a wall that steep. Water would nibble and undercut and wander. It would make ledges and pockets and stair steps Ice, when thick enough, can press against the entire wall at once. It can widen a valley the way a wedged door gets forced open. You hear the river again, and for a moment, it irritates you. It is trying so hard to take credit. It runs right down the center like it owns the place. But it is occupying a space that was excavated for something much larger. The Merced is a tenant in a mansion built by a glacier. You cross a shallow side channel and your boot sinks into soft sediment. It is cold mud, fine and sticky. The meadow is not bedrock. It is fill, a blanket of material that has been settling into the overdeepened trough since the ice left. You pick up a handful and it stains your glove gray. It smells like wet stone and plant decay, the slow layering of post-glacial life. For a second, you picture the valley as it is often sold, a place of timeless granite and eternal beauty. Then you look down at that mud and you remember, this floor is temporary. It is a truce between erosion and deposition, signed in silence. The dawn finally reaches the upper walls, and a thin line of orange light crawls across the rim. The cliff face stays dark, holding on to night like stubborn paint. Cold air slides down from the high country, pooling in the valley bottom. It brushes your cheeks, and it feels like something exhaling from above. You have an urge to climb, to get out of the trough and up onto the shoulders, not for the view, but for the perspective, because down here, the valley can lie to you. It can make you feel sheltered, protected, but the real story is written up high, where the snow used to accumulate and refuse to melt. So, you choose your route. You follow a trail that angles toward a granite bench a little higher than the meadow. It is not steep yet, but it is deliberate. Your legs begin to warm with effort, and your breath turns visible in the beam of your light. As you climb, you pass more erratics, boulders that do not match their surroundings. Some are balanced awkwardly, as if set down without care. They are the glacier's receipts, dropped casually when the ice got tired of carrying them. One boulder has scratches on its own surface, as if it too was dragged along. It was a tool before it was trash. You reach the granite bench, and the valley opens beneath you. Now you can see the floor's width more honestly. The river looks even smaller from here, a thin ribbon, polite and busy. You also notice the way the walls curve, not jagged, but smoothed, as if the valley was molded. The cliff faces are interrupted by domes and rounded shoulders. The shapes are not random. They reflect different kinds of weakness in the granite, different responses to the same pressure. Where the rock is jointed, it breaks in blocks. Where it is massive, it peels in sheets. Where it is exposed, it fractures. Where it is buried, it holds until it cannot. You stand there and you let the valley's scales settle into your bones. A thought arrives, slow and heavy. To carve this, the ice had to be thick enough to fill the valley and press against the walls, which means the glacier was not a polite ton of ice. It was a body, wide and heavy, fed by the high Sierra like a drain that never stopped running. And that brings you to the part you cannot see from here, the origin. The place where snow stopped behaving like snow and started behaving like rock. You start moving again, because you are not just here to admire the aftermath, you are here to catch the culprit in the act. even if it happened tens of thousands of years ago. The trail continues upward and the forest thickens. The smell changes from meadow damp to resin and cold bark. Your fingers brush lichen on a tree trunk, and it feels dry and brittle. Everything up here is adapted to a thin growing season and long winters. It is not hard to imagine deeper cold, not hard to imagine summers that fail to erase winter's work. You pause beside a shallow depression in the granite, a smooth bowl that holds a little water. It is still and dark, reflecting the early sky. You can picture it, filled with snow, year after year, shaded by the surrounding walls. Snow that survives the summer, compresses under its own weight, and becomes fern, that half-step between snow and ice. Fern sounds soft, but fern is a warning. It means accumulation is winning. It means the landscape is beginning to store winter like a hoarder. You keep climbing, and you begin to see the valley behind you as a single channel, a line carved into the range. You imagine it earlier, before the ice, not this broad trough, but a narrower, sharper cut, a river valley that was still trying to saw its way down. The Sierra Nevada was rising, not quickly in human terms, but persistently. Uplift is slow, like a bad habit that never quits. Rivers respond by cutting, trying to keep pace. So pre-glacial Yosemite would have been steeper, tighter, more V-shaped, a valley that looks nothing like the postcard. And yet, the granite was already compromised. Joints, faults, and exfoliation sheets were already there. The rock was strong, but it was not whole. It was a cracked plate waiting for the right pressure. You step over a fallen log, and your boot lands on another polished patch. It surprises you this high, like finding a fingerprint in an unexpected room. The polish here is subtler, weathered by air and water since the ice left, but it is still present, still undeniable. You run your hand along the surface and feel the faint grooves. They align with the valley's axis, pointing down toward where you started, a direction of travel, a flow line. The glacier did not just sit here. It moved, slow, constant, heavy movement driven by gravity and the sheer weight of accumulated snow. That movement is the key difference between snow and glacier. Snow falls and melts. Glacier forms and commits. You glance up toward the higher basins, the places where cirques would form. Even if you cannot see them yet, you know they exist. Bowl-shaped amphitheaters carved at the heads of glaciers, where ice gnaws backward into the mountain. They are the birthplaces, the cradles that become teeth. And you realize something else, another escalation hiding in plain sight. The glacier did not create Yosemite from nothing. It exploited what was already here, a drainage line, a weakness, a pre-cut groove. Ice is efficient in that way. It does not invent problems. It takes existing problems and makes them catastrophic. You stop again because you hear water, but not the river. It is a thin trickle somewhere under the rocks, a small seep in the slope. You follow the sound and find a damp crack in the granite. Water beads there, cold and clear. It slips into the joint and disappears. This is how the rock is prepared, even now. Water enters cracks, freezes, expands, and pries the stone apart. Frost wedging, the simple violence of ice growing by 9%. It is not the glacier yet, but it is the prelude. It is the range being loosened bolt by bolt. You stare at that crack and imagine the same joint under a glacier's weight. Pressure melting at the base, water forced into fractures, then refreezing when pressure drops. Regulation. The ice's strange trick of melting and freezing around obstacles. It lets the glacier both slide and grip, like a hand crawling across stone. When it refreezes inside a crack, it becomes an anchor. Then the glacier moves, and the anchor pulls. Plucking happens, and the rock comes up in blocks. You straighten up and exhale slowly. The air is brighter now, the sun nearing the rim line. You can feel the day beginning, and with it, the valley's ordinary noises will arrive. Birds, distant engines, human schedules. You want to stay ahead of that, deeper into the older silence. So you commit to going higher, toward the origin points where snow once piled up. The trail tightens into switchbacks, and your calves start filing complaints in writing. You pass through shade that still smells like last night, cold and resinous, like the forest never got the memo about sunrise. Granite ribs poke through the soil, and the dirt thins until it feels like the mountain is done humoring plants. You think you are climbing toward a view. Wrong. You are climbing toward a freezer that used to manufacture a moving wall of ice. You step onto a patch of ground that stays damp even in the early light. It is not a spring, not really. It is the aftertaste of snowmelt, the kind that lingers where the sun cannot quite reach. This is where the old story begins. Not on the valley floor, but in the shaded bowls and high benches that learned how to keep winter. You keep gaining elevation, and the air becomes simpler, less pollen, less warmth, less forgiveness. Breathing feels clean and slightly stingy. Your lungs are working with thinner inventory, and they would like you to stop pretending you are not affected. Congratulations, you have arrived at the part of the mountain that makes weakness feel personal. Ahead of you, the forest opens in small, deliberate gaps. Through them, you see pale granite slabs tilted like pages in a book that got left out in the rain. Some surfaces are rough, crystal grains catching the light. Others have that old, unnatural smoothness, like someone took sandpaper to the mountain and then walked away. You kneel again because you cannot help yourself. Your fingers trace a shallow groove, then another. They run straight, and they run in groups. You can feel them more than you can see them. They are not decoration. They are a direction. Up here, the striations are like an arrow pointing you toward the source. You stand and follow that arrow, and the world slowly changes its architecture. The valley behind you drops away, and the terrain ahead becomes a series of basins and steps. It looks like random high country. It is not random. It is a drainage system that used to be an ice factory line. You cross a shallow dip where the ground is oddly level. A small meadow sits there, spongy and bright, holding water like a lazy hand. It feels peaceful, but you can sense the trick. This flatness is not a gift. It is storage, a place where snow could pile up, drift after drift, and not get evicted by summer. You look at the surrounding walls, how they wrap around the basin like a shallow bowl. In winter, wind would have shoveled snow into this shape. In spring, shade would have guarded it. In summer, cool air would have pooled here, protecting what was left. This is how a glacier starts. Not with drama, but with accounting. More snow arrives than leaves. Year after year, the balance sheet stays negative. The landscape starts keeping winter like a debt it refuses to pay off. You imagine the first few decades of that shift? Nothing looks different at first. The same storms come. The same melt happens. But the melt does not finish the job. A patch of snow survives the summer, thin and dirty, tucked into shade. Next winter adds another layer. The old snow gets buried, compressed, and insulated. The mountain starts hiding its own cold. That surviving snow is not glamorous. It is gray around the edges, pocked with dust, seeded with pine needles, and peppered with grit. But it has one talent that changes everything. It sticks around. Under the weight of new snow, the old snow grains begin to change shape. They stop being feathery stars and become rounded beads. Air gets squeezed out. The snow becomes firm, dense, and stubborn. A halfway state that sounds harmless and absolutely is not. Firm is snow that has decided it wants a career. It squeaks under pressure, and it resists your boot in a way fresh snow never would. If you could cut into it, you would see layers, seasons, stacked like old paperwork. And deeper down, those layers would turn blue, not sky blue, a dark, compressed blue that belongs to things that have been pressed into honesty. That blue is glacial ice. It forms when the last pockets of air get pinched off, trapped as tiny bubbles. The ice becomes a solid with memory. It holds years in its stratified body, each storm preserved as a faint line. You cannot see that ice in the present. Not here, not in the same thickness, but you can feel the geometry that remembers it. The basins are shaped like hands that used to hold weight. The ridges between them are narrow, sharpened, like the mountain got shaved from both sides. You walk along one of those ridges, and the drop on either side feels immediate. Your stomach notices. This is the kind of terrain that teaches caution without using words. You pause where the ridge pinches down to granite blocks and sparse dirt. From here, you can look into a bowl below, steep-walled and smooth, almost like a giant scoop mark. A cirque. The word sounds delicate, like music. In human terms, it is a bite. A cirque is what happens when ice sits in one place long enough to start chewing backward. Snow collects in a hollow, turns to ice, and the ice begins to move, even if it is only a little at first. The head wall gets attacked by freeze and thaw, and blocks fall onto the ice. The ice absorbs them, then uses them. You are watching the birth of a tool, because the glacier is not born clean. It is born armed. Rockfall supplies the teeth. Gravity supplies the pressure. Time supplies the patience. You step down into the cirque, careful on loose gravel. The air is colder here, even now. Shade lingers along the base of the wall, and you can feel it like a draft from an open door. The head wall rises above you, fractured with joints, lines that run vertical and diagonal, a grid that makes the cliff look pre-scored. You touch the wall, and it feels dry, gritty, indifferent. These cracks were not made by the glacier alone. Some formed as the granite cooled long ago, contracting, cracking, setting up its own weak points. Others opened as the Sierra rose and stretched, the crust flexing like a slow bending board, and more opened as rock got exposed and pressure released. exfoliation sheets peeling off like the mountain shrugging off an old coat. All of these weaknesses are quiet invitations. Ice does not need to invent a way in. It just needs to show up. You move to the floor of the bowl, where the ground slopes gently outward. In your mind, you lay a blanket of snow here, then another, then 100 more. You let it compact. You let it densify. At a certain thickness, something important happens. The ice begins to behave like a fluid, not liquid, not sloshing, but it deforms, slowly, internally, the way cold taffy sags if you wait long enough. That internal deformation is the first step in ice learning to walk. You picture the ice thickening until it presses against the bowl's lip. There is a moment, and it is not dramatic, when the ice goes from stored to moving. The surface might still look calm, but inside, crystals are rearranging, sliding past each other. The ice is creeping downhill under its own weight. Gravity is doing what it always does. It is simply being given more mass to work with. At the base of that ice, a second, sneakier process begins. Pressure from the ice lowers the melting point just a little. A film of meltwater forms at the bed, even in freezing conditions. It is thin, almost insulting, and yet it changes everything. Because now, the glacier can slide. Basalt sliding is the polite phrase. It is a refrigerator the size of a mountain deciding to scoot downhill and using a smear of water as lubricant. You can almost hear it if you imagine hard enough. Not a roar, a deep, slow grind, like stone being dragged across stone in the dark. Sometimes the bed freezes on, gripping tight. Sometimes the bed warms and the ice slips. This alternation between gripping and sliding is not a flaw. It is a strategy. It lets the glacier both hold and move, like a hand pulling itself along rock. Now the debris at the base becomes important. Rock fragments frozen into the ice press into the granite beneath. They scratch it, gouge it, polish it. This is abrasion, the glacier's sandpaper method. It is not elegant. It is simply thorough, and the grinding produces rock flour, that fine powder you found earlier. It turns meltwater milky. It coats surfaces. It clogs streams. It is the signature of a landscape being reduced into smaller and smaller pieces. But abrasion alone does not give you Yosemite's drama. For that, you need the other method, plucking. You look back at the jointed head wall and the cracks you traced with your fingers. Imagine ice pressing against that wall. On the uphill side of a bedrock bump, pressure increases and melting happens. Water seeps into cracks, then the ice moves over the bump. Pressure drops, and the water refreezes. It freezes inside fractures. It becomes a wedge. The glacier continues moving, and those wedges act like glued handles. Blocks get yanked free. Plucking is not sanding. It is theft. It is the glacier stealing chunks of mountain and carrying them away, sometimes for miles, sometimes until it gets bored and drops them like that erratic boulder you touched in the valley. Now you understand why the valley walls can be so steep. A river undercuts and collapses, but it mostly works from the bottom. A thick glacier presses against the walls and works them from the sides and the base, exploiting joints, prying blocks out. It widens while it deepens. It makes a trough. You climb out of the cirque and continue along the high country, following a chain of basins that feel like linked bowls. These are the accumulation zones, the places where snow used to pile up faster than it could melt. You imagine winters here lasting longer, storms stacking snow in layers that do not fully vanish. You imagine summers cooler, shorter, or simply interrupted by late storms. You do not need the planet to become a full ice ball. You just need the balance to tip for a few thousand years. A few thousand years sounds like a long time to you. To a mountain, it is a slow blink. You stop near a granite ledge and look down valley, tracing the route the ice would have taken. It is not a straight shot. It curves, it funnels, it narrows. That curve matters. Ice does not like inefficiency, but it will follow the path of least resistance, even if it has to bend. And the path of least resistance was chosen long before the glacier arrived. It was chosen when the Sierra Nevada started lifting. The range is basically a tilted block of crust. One side rises steep, the other slopes more gently. Faulting and uplift created a high spine, and rivers responded by cutting into it. The Merced and its ancestors began carving a valley, V-shaped, focused, eager. In that pre-glacial world, the valley would have been narrower. The walls would have been less sheer. The floor would have been more confined. It would have looked like a normal mountain canyon, just with better granite. So when you look at Yosemite now and see a U-shaped trough, you are seeing a canyon that got remodeled by a different contractor. The river did the first cut. It made a groove. The glacier arrived later, saw that groove, and decided to expand the project. And it could expand it because the granite was already pre-fractured. This is the part most postcards do not mention. Granite looks monolithic, but it is a cracked material, full of joints. Those joints form from cooling, from tectonic stress, from unloading. They are planes of weakness, and glaciers love them. A glacier with enough thickness can press ice into those cracks, freeze, and pry. It can quarry huge blocks. That is why you get cliffs that look like they were sliced. Not because the glacier is a laser, but because the rock was already divided into blocks. The glacier just collected them. You walk along a slope where boulders sit in a chaotic scatter. Some are angular, fresh, clearly broken and not transported far. Others are rounded, smoothed, and perched strangely. Till and erratics mixed together like a messy signature. The angular blocks are local collapse, gravity's contribution. The rounded ones are travelers. They were dragged under ice, ground at the edges, and then abandoned when the glacier retreated. You pick up a smaller stone and roll it in your palm. It is gritty. You can feel quartz grains catching against your skin. This is what the glacier makes. Fragments, sand, flour. The mountain gets processed. Now, you make a choice. You follow the imagined ice path downward, not as a hiker, but as the glacier. You let your mind become the ice. You start in these high basins, collecting mass. Every storm adds weight. Every winter adds a layer. Every summer fails to erase it fully. You become thick enough to move, and now you begin to spill over the lip of the basin. At first, the flow is slow, a few inches a day, maybe less. It would be embarrassing if it were not so relentless, because it never stops. It flows through the same channel every day, every year, and the channel gets shaped by that persistence. You squeeze through narrow sections, and pressure increases. You spread into wider sections, and you slow. But you keep moving because gravity does not negotiate. As you descend, You enter the zone where the glacier is not just collecting snow, it is losing ice too, melting at lower elevations. This lower zone is where the glacier must be replenished from above, or it shrinks. During cold periods, replenishment wins. The glacier advances. During warmer periods, melting wins. The glacier retreats. But even in retreat, it can keep carving because the thickest ice remains upstream and the meltwater lubricates the bed. Now you understand something crucial. A glacier does not need to be at its maximum size to do work. It needs thickness and motion. A retreating glacier can still be a very busy demolition crew, backing out of a job while dragging tools across the floor. You follow the imagined ice down into the future Yosemite Valley. The trough becomes a channel for flow. Tributaries join, adding ice from side basins. This matters because Yosemite was not carved by a single polite tongue of ice. It was fed by a system. Multiple glaciers joining, thickening the main flow. Increasing pressure. The main Yosemite Glacier, swollen by tributaries, becomes a heavy, unified body. And now, the valley begins to change rapidly. Not rapidly to you, but rapidly to the granite, because granite does not heal. It only breaks, then breaks again. You picture the valley floor being ground down. Abrasion smooths it. Plucking deepens it in steps, quarrying blocks and leaving basins. Overdeepening begins. This is a technical term. In human terms, it means the glacier digs a hole deeper than the river would ever bother with. A river is limited by base level, by its ability to carry sediment away, by its tendency to find an efficient slope. A glacier does not care about efficient slope in the same way. It cares about pressure and flow. Where ice is thickest and fastest, it can carve below the previous valley floor. It can create a basin, a deep pocket. Later, when the ice leaves, that pocket becomes a meadow or a lake or a wet problem humans will try to drain. You let your mind drop into that deep pocket. It is dark under the ice. No sky, no trees, no birds, only pressure. The ice above you is not a roof, it is a weight. If you could stand at the bed, the world would sound muffled, like being underwater, except the water is solid and moving. Debris embedded in the base scrapes past. Sometimes the ice sticks to the bed, freezing on. Sometimes it slips on meltwater. The bed alternates between being sanded and being quarried. The glacier is both polishing and tearing. Now the sides. As the glacier widens the valley, it attacks the walls. It pushes against them, grinding protrusions, plucking blocks from jointed faces. Where a tributary glacier enters, it adds thickness and pressure. Where the valley bends, the ice scours the outside of the curve more aggressively, like a slow vehicle drifting wide. Corners get rounded, bends get widened, and gradually, the valley loses its V shape. The bottom becomes broad. The walls become steep. A U-shaped trough emerges, the signature of glacial carving. You can see why the Merced looks embarrassed now. It inherited a valley it did not earn. It flows along a floor that was deepened and widened by something far heavier. It is a small stream in a big hallway. Now, a delayed question arrives, one you have probably carried without noticing. Why does Yosemite have those hanging valleys? Why do side canyons spill into the main valley as waterfalls? Bridal veil. Yosemite Falls, Ribbon Fall, when it feels like showing up. Here is the answer, and it is not poetic. The main glacier was thicker and it carved deeper. The tributary glaciers were smaller, with less power. They carved their own valleys, but they could not keep up with the deepening of the main trough. So, when the ice left, the side valleys were left perched above the main valley floor. They hang, and water, being water, takes the shortest route down. It falls. Waterfalls are not just pretty. They are evidence of uneven excavation. They are proof that ice prioritized the main flow and left the tributaries behind. You keep following the glacier downward in your mind, and you begin to see Yosemite's famous faces differently. El Capitan is not just a big wall. It is a massive block of granite with joint patterns that let it be quarried cleanly on certain plains while resisting on others. Half Dome is not just a shape. It is a granite dome that formed through exfoliation and jointing, then got sharpened and exposed by glacial carving, leaving a dramatic face where rock broke away. Domes look soft because exfoliation peels granite in curved sheets, but the process is violent. It is rock relieving pressure by cracking, like a stressed bone finally splintering. And once the glacier removes overburden and scours away debris, those domes stand out, bald and bright. You realize you have been treating the glacier like a sculptor. It is closer to a wrecking ball with a long schedule. It does not create art. It removes material until what remains looks inevitable. You step onto another polished slab and you imagine it under hundreds of feet of ice. The polish becomes more than a texture. It becomes a memory of contact, a record of the glacier's underside pressing down, sliding, grinding. You can almost feel the direction of movement in your bones. Down valley, always down valley. Now, the climate that made this possible is still off stage. You have not named it yet, but you can feel it looming because glaciers do not appear in isolation. They are symptoms of a larger shift. During the Pleistocene, the world cycled through colder and warmer phases. Ice advanced, then retreated. It did this not once, but repeatedly. In the Sierra Nevada, multiple glaciations came through, each one adding its own layer of carving and debris. The glacier that did the biggest work in Yosemite was not a single event. It was a sequence of advances. Cold phases thickened the ice, warm phases pulled it back, then cold returned, and the ice came forward again, reoccupying the same trough, reworking it. Each advance polished what was already smoothed. The stone did not get a chance to heal between visits. It just got reintroduced to the same slow violence again and again until the shape stopped being negotiable. You begin to notice what repetition does to a landscape, not the dramatic kind of repetition like waves hitting a pier, the boring kind, like a heavy chair dragged across the same hardwood floor for 10,000 years. The scratches get deeper, the edges get rounded off, the weak spots get exploited until they become the main story. And in Yosemite, repetition means the valley does not just get carved once, it gets trained into a trough. You keep walking in your mind as the glacier, but you also keep your human senses turned on, because this is not just a history lesson. It is a crime reconstruction. You are looking for the moment the valley stops being a canyon and becomes a machine part. Up valley, you picture cold building like pressure in a sealed room. Down valley, you picture ice leaving signatures that only make sense when you add weight. The next reveal is that the glacier does not carve evenly. It carves where it is thick. It carves where it accelerates. It carves where the bed is rough enough to bite into and wet enough to slide. And that unevenness is exactly how Yosemite gets its personality. You can feel the glacier thickening now, not as an idea, but as a physical presence. It is stacking year after year in the high basins. It is gathering tributaries like side streets, feeding traffic into a highway. It is adding mass until the ice fills the old river valley wall to wall. Not a ribbon anymore, a body. The pressure becomes the important sensation. You imagine standing on the bedrock floor, and the ice above you is not just overhead. It is everywhere. It presses on the floor, yes, but it also presses on the walls, hugging them, forcing itself into corners. A river mostly touches its bed. A thick glacier touches the whole room. This is why the valley gets wide. This is why the walls end up so steep and so clean. The glacier is not cutting a trench. It is reshaping an entire cross-section. Now you come to the part of the job where the glacier stops acting like sandpaper. It starts acting like a backhoe. Overdeepening is already underway, but it does not happen as a smooth, even scoop. It happens in steps and pockets. The bedrock has bumps, ribs, and thresholds, harder and softer zones, and joints that line up like perforations. The glacier responds to those details with the patience of an accountant. Where flow speeds up, abrasion intensifies. Where pressure fluctuates over bedrock bumps, regelation gets more aggressive. Where joints open just enough, plucking becomes the main event. So, the floor drops in certain stretches more than others. Basins deepen, thresholds remain. A future valley floor is being sculpted into a series of bathtubs and sills. You will not see those bathtubs clearly today because they are full of sediment, full of meadow, full of the Merced pretending it is in charge. But they are there, and the glacier made them. You feel a decision coming, and it is not yours. It is the glacier choosing efficiency. It is going to widen this valley because widening reduces friction. A narrow V-shaped canyon squeezes ice, increases drag along the walls, and slows flow. A wider U-shaped trough lets the ice move more smoothly. The glacier is not trying to make beauty, it is trying to reduce resistance. And when it reduces resistance, it increases speed. When it increases speed, it increases erosion. You do not have to be a geologist to understand that this becomes a feedback loop. The valley widens, so ice flows faster. Ice flows faster, so it carves more. It carves more, so the valley widens further. Congratulations, you have invented a self-improving demolition process. You can almost feel the ice reorganizing itself. Ice crystals deform under stress. They rotate and slide. The glacier becomes a conveyor belt with slow internal flow near the center and slower flow at the edges where it drags on rock. But the edges are where the drama happens, because the edges touch the walls, and the walls are made of jointed granite ready to be quarried in clean blocks. You picture the glacier pressing into a jointed cliff. It is not politely scraping, it is forcing itself into cracks. Pressure melts ice on the upstream side of bumps and ledges. Meltwater seeps into fractures. Then the pressure drops, and the water refreezes in the crack. Now the crack contains ice that is attached to the moving glacier. When the glacier continues downhill, it pulls, and the wall gives up a block. The sound in your imagination is not a snap. It is a deep, dull release, like a tooth finally letting go. Now multiply that by centuries. The valley walls get steep because the glacier is removing support at their base and sides. It is not undercutting like a river does. It is quarrying. It is extracting blocks. And when those blocks fall into the ice does not mind. It accepts them. It uses them. It drags them along its belly. And those blocks become new cutting tools. This is one of the nastiest parts of the system. The glacier grows its own teeth by ripping them out of the mouth of the mountain. You follow that thought into the valley bends. A river tends to meander, and it erodes the outside of curves because water accelerates there. A glacier, surprisingly, can do something similar, but with much more weight. In bends, the ice presses harder into the outside wall. It scours corners. It rounds them off. The valley becomes smoother, not just in texture, but in geometry. It begins to look designed. You look at Yosemite today, and those smooth turns feel natural. But what you are really seeing is a heavy flow correcting the sharpness of an older canyon. It is like a slow-moving truck scraping the edges of a narrow alley until the alley becomes a boulevard. The next evidence is not on the floor. It is above you. It is the hanging valleys. And now you do not just understand them intellectually. You can feel why they happen. Tributary glaciers join the main glacier from side basins. They add ice, they add debris, they add pressure, but they are still smaller. They do not have the same thickness. They do not have the same momentum. So they carve their own side valleys into the granite, but they cannot cut them down as deep as the main trough. Then the main glacier comes through, deepens its channel more aggressively, and leaves the tributaries behind. When the ice melts away, the side valleys are stranded above the main floor. Their streams have to drop, so they become waterfalls, not because the valley is romantic, because the excavation was uneven. You can almost watch the future waterfalls being assigned their roles. This side valley gets left high, so it becomes Yosemite Falls. This one becomes Bridal Veil. This one becomes Ribbon, if there's enough water to bother. They are not decorations. They are the receipts for differential erosion. Now you pivot to another quiet fact that changes the whole mood. Overdeepening does not just make basins. It makes instability. When a glacier carves a valley deeper and steeper, it leaves slopes oversteepened. Rock that used to be supported is now exposed. Stress fields change. Exfoliation sheets loosen, joints open a little wider. And when the ice leaves, those walls do not become calm. They become newly vulnerable. The glacier does not just sculpt, it sets traps for the future. You think back to the talus piles you saw in the pre-dawn dark. Those piles are not random rubble. They are the valley walls adjusting to a new shape they did not ask for. The glacier carved too steep, and gravity has been trying to correct it ever since. Now the glacier thickens even more, and you feel the story approaching its irreversible midpoint. The ice is no longer a local feature. It is a regional machine. The Sierra Nevada is feeding it from multiple basins. The climate is holding cold for long stretches. Snowfall accumulates faster than melt can remove it. The glacier expands down valley. It spreads into tributaries. It fills side canyons. It climbs up against walls. And now, the valley you know is fully occupied. not visited, claimed. You imagine standing inside it, not on rock, but on ice. Everything is quiet in a way that feels wrong. Sound does not travel the same under thick ice. Wind does not reach you. Birds do not cross here. There is no smell of pine, only a dim, cold light filtering through snow cover. And then, nothing. And you realize you have lost your usual sensory anchors. The ground under you moves, but too slowly to notice in a moment. The walls are not visible because the ice rises to meet them. The valley is no longer a space between cliffs. It is a corridor inside a moving substance. This is the glacial maximum feeling. Not a date on a chart, a physical takeover. The first reality check is simple. If you could drill down to the bed, you would find the glacier is filthy. The top can look clean, white, innocent. The base is a gravel mine. It is packed with stones, sand, and blocks. That debris came from plucking, from rockfall, from upstream quarrying. The glacier does not just carry it like luggage. It carries it like a weapon. Now the glacier's base alternates between sticking and sliding. In colder spots, the base can freeze onto the bed. In warmer spots, meltwater lubricates it. Pressure melting helps create that meltwater. Friction also contributes because dragging a mountain of ice over rock generates heat. So, you get this frustrating pattern. The glacier grips, then it slips. Each time it grips, it can pluck. Each time it slips, it can abrade. Either way, the bed loses material. You picture boulders being dragged at the base, bumping, grinding, scraping. Car-sized stones become sandpaper. Sand becomes polish. The granite floor becomes smoother, not because it is loved, but because it is being worn down to compliance. And now, at maximum thickness, the glacier can do something rivers cannot. It can carve below the previous outlet. It can deepen basins even more, because it does not care about maintaining a slope for flowing water. It cares about pressure distribution and ice dynamics. Where ice thickens in the center of the valley, pressure increases. Where flow accelerates through narrower sections, abrasion intensifies. And where plucking exploits jointed rock, the bed drops in chunks. The valley floor becomes an engineered profile, a series of deep pockets and shallower thresholds. This matters later, because when the ice leaves, water will fill whatever the glacier hollowed out. And if there is a threshold at the downstream end, that water will not drain easily. A lake will form, or a meadow will persist, or a floodplain will develop in a place humans will insist on building in. The glacier is not just carving scenery, it is pre-designing future water problems. Now you begin to notice the edges of the glacier in your mind, the margins, the sides where ice meets rock and air, because while the center is a conveyor belt, the edges are where debris piles up. Rocks fall from the walls onto the ice surface. They get carried along like cargo. Then, at the glacier's sides, some debris tumbles off, building ridges. Those ridges are moraines. The word sounds quaint. In human terms, it is a bulldozer berm. A moraine is the glacier pushing and dropping a line of rubble. And at maximum, those lines can become massive. They can dam water. They can redirect streams. They can create temporary lakes that outlive the ice itself. You picture the terminus of the glacier, down valley where it thins and melts. Ice carries debris to the front, then drops it as melting outpaces forward motion. The debris accumulates in a ridge at the glacier's snout, an end moraine, a natural dam made of unsorted rock, not carefully engineered, just dumped. And dumped dams can fail. They can leak, they can breach catastrophically. The glacier does not care. It is already moving. You remain inside the glacier's perspective long enough to feel the scale of time. A single year is a thin layer. A decade is a modest stack. 1,000 years is a serious thickness. And during glacial maximum, you are dealing with ice that is not just present, but persistent. So the valley carving reaches a point where the overall shape becomes locked. The U profile is established. The overdeepened sections are excavated. The hanging valleys are inevitable. The domes are exposed and emphasized. The cliffs become cleaner where jointing allowed plucking. And now, even if the glacier vanished instantly, the valley would not revert. The river could not put the rock back. The valley has crossed the threshold into a new identity. This is the irreversible midpoint you have been walking toward. You can feel it because the evidence stops being scattered clues and becomes a coherent system. Everything in the modern valley points back to thick ice doing heavy work. Now you add the human reality check, because humans always show up late and take credit. If you were here at glacial maximum, you would not be taking photographs. You would be dead, and your camera would be under ice. The valley would not be a destination. It would be a frozen corridor, a moving mass, hostile to skin and lungs. And yet, this is the phase that creates the version of Yosemite humans adore. The irony is thick enough to chisel with. You keep moving through the maximum, and you let your attention drift to details that seem small but matter, like the difference between scoured granite and quarried blocks. In some places, the bedrock will be smooth, rounded, polished. In other places, it will be jagged, broken, blocky. That contrast tells you what the glacier was doing locally. Smooth means abrasion dominated. Broken means plucking dominated. And plucking dominates where rock is jointed, fractured, or otherwise ready to fail. So the valley becomes a patchwork of textures, all produced by the same machine, depending on the weaknesses it encountered. You also notice thresholds, rock steps, places where harder granite or less jointed rock resisted excavation. Ice can grind and pluck, but it cannot erase every obstacle equally. So some bedrock ribs remain. Later, those ribs will control where water pools, where rapids form, where sediments settle. Even the river's future path will be constrained by what ice could not quite remove. Now you let yourself float upward, out of the bed, up through the ice. You picture layers, snow on top, fern beneath, blue ice deeper down, air bubbles trapped, dust layers marking ancient summers, volcanic ash from faraway eruptions settling and getting buried. The glacier is not just a sculptor, it is an archive. It records climates and storms while it demolishes the valley beneath, and the record is quiet. It does not care if anyone reads it. It just accumulates. The next pivot is unavoidable. Climate is not stable. Even at maximum warming begins. Not dramatic warming at first, just summers that linger longer. Just winters that arrive a little late, just a gradual shift in the balance sheet. And when the balance tips, the glacier does not politely stand down. It starts to thin. It starts to melt from the top and from within. Meltwater appears, not just at the edges, but inside the ice, carving channels like veins. You hear it in your imagination. A hidden river under the ice, rushing through a tunnel, carrying rock flour in suspension. It is the glacier beginning to dissolve. You might think retreat is a simple reversal. Ice goes away, valley is revealed. But retreat is messy. Retreat is collapse. Retreat is the glacier losing its grip, then regripping, then breaking apart. Retreat happens in pulses. A cold decade can stabilize the front, a warm stretch can yank it back. The ice margin can stagnate, becoming thin and dead, while the upper glacier still flows. So you do not get a neat exit. You get a slow unmaking. And when the ice begins to let go, the valley experiences a sudden change in management. For thousands of years, ice was in charge of moving debris. Now water takes over, and water is faster. Not stronger, not heavier, but faster. It runs through channels under the ice, and when the ice pulls back, those channels become open streams. Meltwater pours into the overdeepened basins. It ponds behind moraine dams and rock thresholds. It forms temporary lakes, cold lakes full of suspended rock flour, milky and opaque. The surface can look calm, but the inflow can be violent. And the dams holding them are not stable structures. They are piles. You picture one of those lakes swelling during a warm season. Water rises against a moraine ridge. The moraine is made of mixed material. Big blocks, gravel, sand, all jumbled. Water seeps through, carving small channels. A leak becomes a trickle. A trickle becomes an incision. And if the incision cuts deep enough, the whole dam can breach. A flood rushes down valley, carrying sediment, ripping vegetation, rearranging the valley floor. This is not a guarantee, but it is a risk written into every dumped dam. The glacier's exit includes the possibility of sudden outburst floods. Nature does not do refunds. It does sequels. Now, as the glacier thins, it exposes the valley walls. Those walls have been pressed against, chilled, and supported by ice. When that support disappears, the rock responds. Stress is redistributed, cracks propagate, exfoliation sheets loosen, and gravity starts harvesting. Rockfall increases. Debris flows happen when meltwater saturates loose sediment on steep slopes. Talus piles grow. The valley becomes louder, not with human noise, with stone moving. You remember that crack you heard in the dark earlier. Now imagine a valley full of those cracks, day after day, season after season, as the walls adjust to being free. You also notice that the valley floor is not bedrock everywhere. As the ice retreats, it leaves behind till, unsorted sediment, a chaotic mix of clay, sand, gravel boulders. It fills low spots. It smooths over bedrock irregularities. It creates a surface that can hold water because fine material reduces drainage. So you get meadows forming in overdeepened sections, wetlands, floodplains, places where the river can wander. The Merced returns, finally stepping back into a valley that is empty of ice, but it is returning to a channel that is too big. The valley is overbuilt. The river is small, so the Merced does what small rivers do in big valleys. It braids, it meanders, it deposits sediment, it builds gravel bars, it shifts its course over time. It floods low spots during high flow. It makes the valley floor dynamic, even if it looks tranquil. And humans, later, will interpret this tranquility as permission. You let the glacier retreat farther, up valley, back toward the high basins. The polished pavements appear, exposed to air for the first time in thousands of years. They start weathering immediately. Lichens colonize. Water seeps into microcracks. Freeze-thaw cycles resume. The stone begins to roughen again, but the polish remains in protected spots like a stubborn memory. Erratics are left behind, perched in odd places. Some sit alone on bedrock knobs like misplaced statues. They become the easiest evidence for a human to understand. This rock does not belong here. Therefore, something carried it. And if you follow the mineral match, you can trace the path of transport back up valley. You can do detective work with stones. So you start doing it because your brain likes a scavenger hunt when it is tired. You move from boulder to boulder, reading grains and colors like barcodes. A pinkish feldspar here, a darker hornblende there, a mica glitter that does not match the local bedrock. Each erratic is a misplaced paragraph. Together, they spell out a route from high cirques down into the trough. And the route tells you something else. The glacier did not wander. It stayed inside rails, guided by topography and weakness, like a train that cannot leave its tracks. Now you notice the other kind of evidence. The evidence that is not sitting politely in a meadow. It is piled, ridged, and inconvenient. You walk toward a low rise where the ground suddenly becomes cobbly, lumpy, unsorted. The stones are mixed sizes, from sand to car-sized blocks, all dumped together. No layers, no neat sorting, no river logic. This is till. And till is what you get when ice drops everything at once. Like a stressed mover abandoning boxes on your lawn. You crouch and pick up a fist-sized clast. One side is faceted, flat like it was ground on a wheel. Another side is scratched fine lines like it was dragged under pressure. That is your clue that this rock spent time at the glacier base. Not on top, not beside. At the grinding interface, where everything gets used, you look around and realize the valley is littered with these small, stubborn objects, rounded pebbles that belong to rivers, angular blocks that belong to gravity, faceted stones that belong to ice. Yosemite is not one process. It is a crowded timeline. Now the glacier has retreated far enough that the valley is open to the sky again. And the sky does what it always does when it gains access. It starts raining, snowing, warming, cooling, and generally middling. You can almost feel the first post-glacial summers. Sunlight hits fresh, wet sediment. Puddles form in depressions the glacier carved. The air smells like raw rock and cold mud. And the first plants move in, not because the place is welcoming, but because life is opportunistic. But water is faster than plants. Water takes the first shift. Meltwater, then rainfall, then stream flow. Starts organizing the chaos. It finds low spots in the till, and it cuts little channels. It finds steeper slopes of loose debris, and it triggers debris flows when storms hit. Gravity and water team up, and they do not need permission. You walk along the base of a cliff, and you look at the talus again. It is bigger than you want it to be. Each pile is an accounting of rockfall events, stacked in silence. Some blocks are fresh, pale, sharp. Others are darkened, weathered, crusted with lichen. Older tenants. You can tell the valley walls have been shedding for a long time. You can also tell they are not done because the glacier left them over steep, and gravity hates over steep the way a bureaucrat hates a blank form. It will correct it eventually, with or without your schedule. Now comes a new reveal, one that confuses people who expect glaciers to be the whole story. The glacier carved the trough, but it also delivered the ingredients for the valley to partly refill. That seems unfair, but the planet is not here to be fair. When ice scours bedrock, it makes sediment. When ice plucks blocks, it makes rubble. When ice retreats, it drops both into the newly carved space. So the moment the glacier leaves, the valley begins to accumulate again. Not rock, not in large pieces, but sediment. Fine material settles in low spots, especially where water ponds. Coarser gravel gets pushed around by rivers. Every flood rearranges the furniture. You step into a meadow and feel the ground flex under your weight. That spongy feeling is not softness. It is saturation. It is the water table sitting close to the surface because fine sediments hold water and the trough has poor drainage. Meadows are not just scenic. They are a drainage problem that learned how to grow grass. You follow the Merced now, and it feels less embarrassed. It has a job again. It is not carving the valley, but it is managing the fill. It takes sediment from upstream. It drops some on bars. It picks some up again during high flow. It braids when it has too much load. It meanders when it has room. In places, it does both. Because it is indecisive and the valley is wide. You watch the river curve and you realize the calm is a trick. This river is doing demolition too, just at a different scale. It eats banks one bite at a time. It undercuts a root mass. A chunk collapses. The channel shifts a few feet. The meadow boundary moves. If you built something there, it would be briefly owned by the Merced. Now you start seeing the valley as a negotiation. Sediment comes in from the walls and tributaries. Sediment gets carried out by the river. Sometimes, when input exceeds output, the valley floor rises. When floods have enough energy, the river evacuates more material and the channel deepens. So the valley pretends to be stable, but it is actually balancing a living budget. And humans, when they arrive, have a habit of assuming the budget is fixed. You can already sense the trouble just from the shape of the floor. Flat land in a mountain valley looks like a gift, but flat land in a glacial trough is usually a floodplain or a wetland or both. It is flat because it is a place where water slows down and drops its load. It is flat because it is built of deposits. It is flat because it is temporary. Congratulations, you have found the exact kind of terrain humans love to pave. Now, you take another step through time because the valley after ice is not a single moment. It is a series of aftershocks. The first 1,000 years after deglaciation are noisy. Lakes form behind moraines and bedrock thresholds. Those lakes trap sediment like a filter. They slowly fill, becoming marsh, then meadow. As they fill, the river jumps channels. searching for a new, efficient path. Meanwhile, the walls keep failing. Rockfall events remain frequent because the stress state in the granite is still adjusting. The ice is gone, so the rock warms and cools more dramatically. Water gets into new cracks, freeze and thaw returns. Tree roots pry, exfoliation continues. The walls are in rehab, and rehab is not quiet. You can imagine standing here in that early post-glacial time. No pavement, no campgrounds, just water, mud, and sudden stone movement. And you would have an unnerving awareness that the valley is still being made, even without the ice. Now you return to the present again, because your feet are still on modern ground. The sun is higher, the walls have color now, pale granite with warm highlights. You can see streaks on cliff faces, black stains where water runs in storms. You can see lighter scars where fresh rock has been exposed by recent falls. Those pale scars are the valley blinking. They are the reminder that this is not a fossil landscape. It is active. You walk along a paved path, and the irony is not subtle. Humans have drawn lines over a system that hates lines. They have built straight edges next to a river that curves. They have built rooms next to cliffs that shed blocks. They have built schedules next to a place that operates in deep time, and they call it management. You stop near the Merced and you listen to it. In summer, it chatters. In spring, it roars with meltwater. In drought, it thins and warms, exposing gravel bars like bones. It is seasonal, moody, and responsive to snowpack, which means it is also responsive to climate. And climate is not done changing. But before you drift into the modern mess, there is one more post-glacial consequence to understand. The valley is not only a trough, it is a trough with steps. Remember those bedrock thresholds, the ribs the glacier could not quite erase. They still matter. They control where water accelerates, where it slows, where it pools. They control where sediment gets trapped. They control where wetlands persist. They're like speed bumps in the valley's plumbing. And humans keep trying to flatten them, metaphorically and sometimes literally, because humans prefer water to behave. Water does not behave. It negotiates. You walk toward one of the valley's low areas, where the ground is greener and wetter. You can see willows and sedges, plants that like their feet wet. You can smell damp soil, that rich, earthy smell that comes from slow decomposition. That smell exists because water stays here. And water stays here because the trough is overdeepened and partly blocked. Some of that blocking is bedrock geometry. Some is sediment dropped by ice and reworked by the river. Some is moraine material, still sitting in places like a careless dam. The valley floor is not a simple slope. It is a series of basins, pretending to be one flat thing. Now, the delayed payout. Why does the valley have such broad meadows instead of a single deep channel? Because the glacier made space, then left debris. Then the river inherited a wide, low-gradient floor. With low gradient, the river loses the power to carry coarse sediment, so it drops it. With dropped sediment, channels shift. With shifting channels, floodplains develop. With floodplains, meadows form. So the meadow is not just ecology, it is hydraulics inherited from ice. And then humans arrived and saw the meadow and thought, perfect. A place to build hotels and roads and parking lots. Because humans see flatness as stability, flatness is often just the planet holding still for a moment. You can feel the second reality check coming, because it always does. Human infrastructure in Yosemite Valley has a complicated relationship with water. The Merced floods, not always catastrophically, but regularly enough to remind you who owns the low ground. During big winter snow years, spring melt swells the river. Warm storms can fall on snow, adding rain to meltwater, a combination that turns polite rivers into brown engines. The valley floor, being flat and low, gets submerged. Water spreads across meadows, channels jump, gravel gets rearranged. And every time it happens, humans act surprised, as if water has never done this before. But the river is only doing what the trough allows. It is using the wide floor the glacier created. It is reoccupying the space that was never meant to be permanent. You stand on a bridge and look down at the current. It does not look dangerous today. It looks cold, clear, maybe even inviting if you ignore the temperature. But the banks show you a different story. Eroded edges, exposed roots, deposited sand in thin sheets, driftwood caught in branches, left behind by higher water. The river keeps a record too, just not in ice layers. Now you look up again, because water is not the only modern hazard. The walls are still adjusting. Rockfalls still happen. Some are small, a few stones ticking down a slab. Some are massive, the kind that leave dust clouds and close roads. And when a big rockfall hits the valley floor, it can block the river. It can create temporary lakes. It can redirect flow into new channels. So even without glaciers, you still have sudden geomorphic events. The valley is capable of changing quickly when it feels like it. You walk near the base of a cliff and notice the texture of the granite. In places, it is smooth and rounded, glacial polish preserved. In other places, it is rough, pitted, weathered by air and water. That contrast is time made visible. The polished surfaces are places that have not been heavily altered since ice left. The rougher surfaces are places where weathering has had more access, more water, more freeze-thaw. You are looking at a landscape that is part artifact, part active construction site. Now you begin to understand the valley's modern calm as a thin crust. Underneath, the processes are still running. Erosion on the walls, deposition on the floor, channel migration in the river, occasional fires resetting the forest, occasional floods rearranging sediment, occasional rockfalls changing the valley's layout. All of it paced by climate, and climate paced by forces that do not care about your vacation plans. Speaking of fires, here comes the part humans prefer to treat as an external disaster. Fire is not external here. It is part of the system. In the Sierra Nevada, many forests evolved with frequent, low to moderate intensity fires. Fire clears understory. Fire recycles nutrients. Fire shapes what grows and how dense it becomes. And density matters for water. Dense forests intercept snow. They change melt timing. They affect how much water reaches streams and how fast. Fire changes that. So if you suppress fire for long enough, you change the forest structure, you build up fuel. And when fire finally returns, it can be hotter, more severe. It can strip soil. It can increase runoff. Then storms hit, and debris flows become more likely. Sediment surges into channels. The Merced gets choked with load. Flood risk changes. So even fire is connected to the glacial inheritance, because the valley floor is a trap for sediment and the river has limited slope to move it out. The valley is a bowl for consequences. You walk through a stand of trees and notice the ground cover. Pine needles, cones, small charred fragments in places, evidence of past burns. You smell sun-warmed resin. You hear wind in the canopy, soft and repetitive. It would be easy to fall into the idea that this is a stable forest in a stable valley. But the trees are on deposits. The roots go into sediment, not bedrock in many places. And sediment shifts, floods undercut, channels move, fire resets. Nothing here is permanent. It is just persistent. Now you make another decision because you are still following the evidence. You climb slightly toward a point where you can look across the valley and see the whole cross-section. From up here, the U-shape is not subtle. The floor is broad, the sides steep, the shoulders rounded. The geometry is loud. You can also see the hanging valleys more clearly, the side canyons perched, their streams dropping as falls. Each waterfall is a tributary valley that got outpaced by the main glacier. Each one is a vertical reminder of differential erosion. And as you watch, you realize the waterfalls are also part of modern erosion. Waterfalling is energy being spent. It undercuts the plunge pool. It pries blocks. It sends spray that freezes in winter, expanding cracks. So the waterfalls are not only evidence of past ice, they are active agents now, chiseling at the edges of their own hanging valleys. Given enough time, they will cut headward, slowly reducing their hang. Not quickly, not dramatically, but steadily. That is the theme, steadiness. Now you pivot again, because there is a deeper piece of unfinished business. The Sierra Nevada is still rising, not like a rocket, like bread dough, slow, persistent, inevitable. Uplift continues due to tectonic forces and isostatic adjustments. Isostatic rebound is the term. It sounds like a fitness class. It is actually the crust responding to unloading, rising, after weight is removed. The Sierra was loaded by ice during glaciations. As ice melts away, the crust can rebound upward. Slowly. It is not the only driver of uplift here, but it contributes to the sense that the range is not done moving. And as the range rises, rivers respond. They incise. They cut. So even though glaciers carved the trough, rivers can still deepen channels in places, especially where they encounter thresholds or steeper gradients. The valley is a conversation between uplift and erosion. Uplift gives rivers potential energy. Glaciers exploit that potential by carving when climate allows. Rivers take over in warmer phases, reworking deposits and cutting where they can. And gravity never stops, adjusting slopes to whatever new shape gets imposed. So when you look at Yosemite, you are not looking at a finished sculpture. You are looking at a process caught mid-gesture. You sit for a moment because your legs want to. The stone beneath you is warm on the surface now, sunlit, but you remember it was cold before dawn. That daily temperature swing matters. It expands and contracts rock. It works cracks. It loosens exfoliation sheets. Small changes, repeated, become real change. Time is patient and granite is brittle. Now you let your mind return to the ice one more time, because the retreat story has another twist. Retreat does not just leave lakes and till. It can leave buried ice. Blocks of dead ice can get covered by sediment. They sit there, insulated, melting slowly from within. As they melt, the ground above can subside. You get kettle depressions, little sinks in the landscape. They can fill with water. They can become ponds, then marsh. So some post-glacial topography is not carved. It is collapsed, a landscape of holes where ice, once hid under dirt, slowly disappearing, like a secret. You look at a small pond near a meadow edge and wonder briefly if it began that way. Not all ponds do, but some do. And the thought adds another layer of instability to the valley floor. Not only can water move sediment around, the ground itself can settle as buried ice melts, if it exists. In Yosemite, most of that buried ice story is ancient, but the principle remains. Glacial landscapes often have these delayed collapses, like a building settling long after construction. Now comes a human-flavored reveal. People often assume Yosemite Valley is mostly bedrock. In reality, much of the valley floor is sediment fill. Deep fill in some places. The bedrock trough is there, but it is buried under layers of glacial deposits, river gravels, floodplain silts, debris flow fans, and organic material. So when you stand on the meadow, you are not standing directly on the glacier's carved floor. You are standing on what the valley has been collecting since the ice left. That matters, because it means the present ground surface is not the original post-glacial surface. It has been rising, slowly but steadily. The valley is filling itself in. Not enough to erase the walls, obviously, but enough to change drainage patterns, meadow extent, flood behavior. It is like a bathtub that keeps getting a thin layer of dust. Eventually, the shape changes. You walk toward the edge of a debris fan, where a small side creek comes out of a steep tributary. The fan spreads across the valley floor like a handprint. This is how side systems deliver sediment. During intense storms, the creek becomes a slurry carrying sand, gravel, and cobbles. It emerges from a confined channel into the open valley, loses energy, and drops its load. Fan grows. Fan pushes the main river. Main river shifts. Floodplain changes. So even small tributaries can steer the Merced over time. Simply by dumping material where the valley is wide enough to accept it, you are watching a slow competition for space. Water wants a channel. Sediment wants to pile. The valley floor keeps getting remodeled by these small acts. Now you feel the narrative pulling you forward toward the present-day management illusion. Because once people started building here, they tried to freeze that competition. They tried to tell the river where to go, and the fans where not to spread, and the meadows where to stay dry. They built levees, riprap, straightened channels in places, and then acted surprised when the river kept meandering anyway. A river in a low-gradient glacial trough will always look for its own path. If you constrain it, you increase energy in the constrained reach, so the river starts chewing harder at whatever edge you left unarmored. It digs at the base of a bank until the sod slumps in, like a rug pulled off a table. Then it drops that stolen soil a little downstream, because it always needs somewhere to put the evidence. You walk along the Merced and notice how the outside of each bend looks raw. Roots hang out like exposed wiring, still gripping air. The inside of each bend looks calmer, a gentle slope of pebbles that were recently traveling. This is the river doing what rivers do when you give them room. And when you do not give them room, it does the same thing, just more violently. A straightened channel is a shortened channel. Shorten the distance, and you steepen the slope without meaning to. Steepen the slope, and you give the water more energy per step. More energy means deeper scour, faster bank erosion, and a stronger urge to escape your line. You cannot negotiate away physics with a shovel and a meeting. So you stand there, listening to a stream that looks like a lullaby, and you remember it is also a transport system for everything loose in this valley. You watch a few grains of sand roll along the bottom in the clear shallows. They are not random grains. They are granite that has been demoted several times, first from bedrock to block, then block to cobble, then cobble to sand. Every step is a loss of identity, and the river is the clerk stamping the paperwork. You step off the path and into a meadow. Because the grass looks forgiving, your boot sinks slightly, and cold water rises around the sole. The meadow is a sponge sitting on fine sediment. Fine sediment holds water the way gossip holds a town. Too well, too long. This is why humans have always tried to drain meadows. Not because they hate beauty, but because they hate wet shoes and flooded basements. You follow the slight dip of the ground toward the river again. You notice how the valley floor is not perfectly flat. It is subtly lumpy, with low swales and barely raised ridges. Those ridges are old bars, old flood deposits, old fan edges. The valley floor is a palimpsest, written and rewritten by water that keeps changing its mind. And now you add the final ingredient humans like to ignore: the cliffs above you. The walls are still shedding rock, not constantly, but faithfully. Every winter, water seeps into joints, freezes, and pries them wider. Every summer, heat expands the outer layers, and contraction makes them crack again at night. Every storm adds weight and lubrication to loose debris on steep slopes. So the valley floor gets fed from above, even when the river is quiet. You look at a talus pile again and realize it is not just a pile. It is a conveyor belt endpoint. Gravity delivers blocks. The river eventually delivers the smaller pieces away. In the middle, humans keep trying to place picnic tables, like the system will pause for them. You keep walking, and the day is now fully awake. Voices carry across the valley, thin and bright against the granite. A car door closes somewhere, a clean little click that feels out of place. You let the human sounds exist, but you do not give them the center, because the center is still the valley itself, still the glacial trough, pretending to be tame. You stop where you can see a stretch of bank armored with rock. Angular blocks are stacked along the edge, an attempt at permanence. The water slides past them, and you can see small eddies forming at the ends. Where the armor stops, the current starts nibbling at the softer bank. The river is patient, and it is excellent at finding seams. It behaves like water on a countertop, always seeking the one gap you forgot. You step closer and see the smaller truth, fine sediment swirling in the eddy. That cloudiness is the valley floor being redistributed. Not in dramatic chunks today, just a faint stain of movement. But movement is the habit, and habits become landscapes. Now you make a choice that feels small but matters. You look up, not at the famous faces, but at the scars. Fresh rock is brighter, cleaner, almost chalky against older granite. Some scars are narrow, like a peeled strip. Some are wide fans, where a whole section failed and slid down in a roar you did not hear. Those scars are the valley's reminder that the walls were steepened by ice. Ice did not just carve a trough, it oversteepened a problem. And now gravity is the long-bored engineer assigned to fix it. You walk along the base of a cliff and keep a respectful distance. Not because you are afraid of the cliff, but because you understand its schedule is not yours. A block can wait 100 years, then leave on a random Tuesday. It does not do it for drama. It does it because cracks finally connect. You listen for the subtle sounds, small ticks, faint pings. Most of the time you hear nothing. And that is the point. Rock failure is quiet until it is not. You step onto a polished slab near the river, and the stone feels warm now. Sunlight makes the granite comfortable, like it is trying to charm you. You run your hand along it and feel micro roughness, weathering starting to win. The glacial polish is still there, but it is being erased one grain at a time. This is what the modern valley is, a slow overwrite of a glacial signature. The ice wrote the big letters. Water and gravity are now scribbling in the margins. Humans are adding sticky notes and acting like the book belongs to them. You start thinking about time again, because the valley forces you to. This place looks ancient, and it is. But its current shape is young by geologic standards. Young enough that the walls are still adjusting, young enough that the floor is still filling. And while you are standing here, the Sierra Nevada is still doing its slow lift. Not a sudden shove, more like a long exhale upward. That uplift keeps rivers energetic in the long term. It keeps slopes steep enough that rock keeps falling. It keeps the system from settling into a quiet old age. You walk back toward the river and watch it slide around a bend. You imagine the same bend under ice, rounded by pressure and abrasion. Then you imagine it under floodwater, brown and loud, carrying logs and cobbles. The same curve, different sculptors, different tools. The valley's calm is just which tool is holding the chisel today. You take another step and notice something almost insulting. A sign warning about flooding. A printed reminder, as if water reads. The sign marks a high water line from a past flood year. You stand beside it and look at the height, trying to map it onto the meadow. It is high enough to turn picnic areas into shallow lakes, high enough to float away anything not bolted down, and some things that are. You do not need to see the flood to understand it. The valley floor is wide, the gradient is low, the trough is generous. Water arriving fast has nowhere elegant to go, so it spreads slow and heavy, reclaiming what was always its overflow space. This is not the river misbehaving. This is the valley doing what its glacial geometry allows. Now you feel the modern tension sharpen. People want the valley to be a static museum. The valley wants to be a working system. So management becomes a kind of ritual, a seasonal attempt to hold still. Channels get repaired after floods. Banks get armored again. Facilities get moved, sometimes reluctantly, sometimes after the river forces the decision. Every intervention is a vote for stability. Every flood is the valley counting the votes and ignoring them. You look at the trees near the river and you notice some are leaning. Their roots have been undercut on one side, and they are negotiating gravity. A few will fall into the water during the next high flow. When they do, they become part of the river, forming jams, redirecting current. Wood is not just scenery here, it is hydraulics. A log jam can push water into a new channel or help build a bar. It can also increase flood height locally, backing water up like a clogged drain. The river uses whatever it finds. It does not care if you thought that tree was picturesque. You keep moving and you pass a spot where the bank is scalloped. Small alcoves have been bitten out, each one a minor collapse. These are not catastrophic events, just steady loss. The kind of loss that only becomes obvious when you compare photographs decades apart. That is the problem with slow change. It feels like nothing until it is everything. You stop and look across the valley at a waterfall, a white thread dropping from a hanging valley. In the afternoon light, it looks delicate, almost ornamental, but you remember what it means. That side valley was carved by a smaller glacier that could not keep up, and now the stream is paying the difference by falling. At the base, spray keeps the rock wet, which keeps weathering active. In winter, that spray freezes into ice, and the ice wedges cracks wider. So the waterfall is both a remnant of glaciation and a modern tool of erosion. It is still working, just with different patience. You realize the valley is full of these hybrids, features born of ice but maintained by other forces. Dunes exposed by glaciers, now exfoliating in the sun. Cliffs steepened by plucking, now collapsing in rockfalls. Basins overdeepened by ice, now filled with meadow sediment. Everything is a handoff. Nothing is a final product. You step onto a slightly raised terrace, and the grass changes. Drier, shorter, less lush than the saturated low spots. This higher ground might be an old floodplain level, abandoned when the river incised a little. Or it might be a debris fan edge built by a side creek during a violent storm. Either way, it is evidence that the valley floor has history within history. Even after the glacier left, the valley has been building layers of its own. You squat and grab a pinch of soil. It is dark at the top, organic, full of decayed plant matter. Below that, it turns gray and gritty, mineral heavy. That lower layer is glacial inheritance, reworked by water, mixed with time. You rub it between your fingers and feel the fine texture again. Rock flour does not stop existing just because the ice is gone. It becomes the base material for the meadow, the fine grains that hold moisture. The glacier is still controlling your wet shoes thousands of years later. Now your mind drifts upward, toward the rim. Not in a romantic way, but in a structural way. The rim is the boundary of the old ice, the edge of where thickness mattered most. Above it, snow still gathers in winter. It melts out now, mostly because the climate is warmer than during those big glacial phases. But you know how close the system is to tipping because you have seen it before. Snow that stays becomes fern. Fern becomes ice. Ice begins to move, and movement begins to carve. The whole story can restart if the balance shifts again. Not tomorrow, not next year, but on the timescale the planet prefers. You walk under a tree canopy and feel the temperature drop. Shade still works like it used to, preserving cool, slowing melt. You imagine a colder century, then another. You imagine storms arriving with more snow and fewer warm rains. You imagine summers failing to clear the high bowls. It does not take a miracle, just persistence. This is the unsettling comfort of glaciation. It is not a monster that must be summoned. It is a process that returns when conditions allow, and the conditions are always changing, because climate is a moving target. You hear a faint rustle in the grass, a small animal making its rounds. Life is busy here, always adapting to the valley's shifting rules. Plants colonize fresh deposits. Trees root into sediment that might flood next spring. Insects time their hatches to melt water pulses. Everything is built around variability, except the human structures. Those are built around the fantasy of consistency. You walk past a cleared area where people have tried to give the river more room. Banks look less armored. Channels look more braided. It is a rare admission, a quiet policy change written in land shape. Give the river space, and it can spend its energy wandering instead of cutting. It can spread floods thin instead of forcing them deep. It can move sediment around without needing to tear at a single spot. This is not generosity, it is harm reduction. You cannot stop a river, but you can stop daring it to prove a point. You stand still and let the soundscape settle. Wind in the canopy, water over gravel, a distant voice, then silence again. In that silence, you can almost hear the deeper clock. The granite cooling, contracting, opening cracks by fractions. The uplift continuing microns at a time, imperceptible, until it is a mountain range. The river shifting grain by grain, rearranging the valley floor like a slow hand smoothing a bedspread. And far above, snow gathering in bowls that remember how to hold it. You look back down at the river and try to see it as a descendant, not the creator of the valley, but the inheritor of a carved corridor. It is doing what it can with what it has been given: a low gradient trough, a floor of sediment, walls that keep feeding debris. The Merced is a maintenance worker assigned to a giant hall. It cannot change the architecture. It can only rearrange furniture, sweep dust, and occasionally knock over a chair during a flood. You step closer to the water and watch it curl around a rock. A tiny standing wave forms, shivers, disappears. That little wave is the same physics that once moved ice. Fluid finds a path, meets resistance, adjusts. Scale changes, rules stay. The planet loves repeating itself with different materials. Now you notice the light on the cliffs again. The sun slides across the faces, warming one section while another stays cool in shade. That temperature gradient matters. It sets up stress differences in the rock. Small expansions, pulling against contractions. Over decades, those stresses help exfoliation sheets detach. Over centuries, they help joints widen. Over millennia, they help cliffs shed blocks. This is why rockfalls do not stop when the glacier is gone. They are part of the aftercare plan. For a valley that was carved too steep, you shift your weight and feel how tired your body is getting. Not exhausted, just heavy, like your muscles are becoming aware of gravity again. It fits the place. Yosemite is a gravity story told in ice, water, and falling stone. You take one more slow walk along the meadow edge. The grass trembles in a light breeze, and you can see small ripples in the seed heads. It is easy to see peace here, but peace is just what erosion looks like on a quiet day. Because the forces that made this valley do not stop working. They only switch masks. Ice becomes water. Water becomes vegetation. Vegetation becomes soil. Soil becomes a slip plane for a debris flow when a storm finally hits. And through it all, granite keeps cracking in slow motion. You glance up toward the high country again, where the sky is a deeper blue. You think about how few glaciers remain in the Sierra Nevada now, small and shrinking. They are not the valley sculptors they once were, but their absence is also a kind of presence. No more thick ice to buttress the walls, no more ice to store water as long-term mass. Snowpack becomes more important and more variable. Rivers become flashier in some years, anemic in others. The valley feels the difference, even if tourists only notice when waterfalls go quiet. You keep that thought close because it is the modern pivot. When ice dominated, change was slow but immense. Now, with less ice, change can be faster in smaller ways. More rain on snow events, longer dry seasons stressing forests, bigger fires that strip slopes, then storms that mobilize ash and sediment. The valley becomes a sensitive instrument again, reacting quickly to swings. You walk past a side creek mouth and see fresh gravel spread across the fan. The stones are bright, recently washed clean. That means a recent high flow, a storm pulse, a quick delivery of sediment. The fan is still growing, still pushing into the valley floor. It is a small reminder that the valley is not only shaped by the main river, it is shaped by every steep tributary dumping its load, where the slope suddenly relaxes. You can imagine the next big storm. Water roaring down that side canyon, carrying boulders like marbles, then spilling into the main valley, losing speed, and dropping everything in a spread. The Merced will arrive later and try to sort it out. Sometimes it will succeed. Sometimes it will simply bend around it, and the channel will migrate again. So you keep walking, and you keep noticing how every feature is a negotiation. Cliff versus gravity, fan versus river, river versus bank armor, meadow versus drainage, and above all, time versus every assumption you brought in with you. You stop at the edge